And now, as promised or threatened, we get to the pharaoh who tried to break with old traditions and establish monotheism in Egypt. So one day Amenhotep IV had a vision. And after that, he decided that henceforward Egyptians should worship only one god, Aten. Now, the relationship between Amenhotep IV's Aten and the traditional Egyptian god Amun-Re is a little confusing. Aten was actually an aspect of Amun-Re, the sun disk, or the rays that emitted from the sun. Basically, although this is actually a little too simplistic, he was the god of light. Under Akhenaton, Aten became the only god, the source of all being, and intriguingly was identified as being both male and female. Let me just note the worship of other gods persisted, and there's some evidence that Akhenaton even tolerated this. He may not have had any choice. As part of his grand strategy for remaking Egyptian culture and religion, Amenhotep renamed himself Akhenaton and built an entirely new capital with the same name at a virgin site called Amarna. The capital was largely abandoned within a decade of Akhenaton's death. His son, Tutankhamun, will end our presentation with King Tut, did not make Akhenaton his capital, but indeed mostly turned back to his father's religion. So why does he look so weird? Actually, scholars are still debating this. Texts in Amarna tombs describe the god Aten as mother and father of us all. So perhaps this was an effort to portray the pharaoh, Aten's representation on earth, as both a male and female figure. By the way, androgynous is a term worth knowing. It means having both male and female features combined. So maybe sculptors were directed to portray Aten's earthly representation, Akhenaton, as both a male and female. Other scholars speculate that these statues captured aspects of Akhenaton's real appearance and might even reflect deformities that stemmed from too much inbreeding. And in fact, a mummy has been tentatively identified as Akhenaton. They're not entirely sure. And indeed, the body in this mummy does have a long skull and an elongated chin. But keep in mind that while these Amarna period depictions may have been more naturalistic, they still obeyed their own set of conventions. Egyptian artists are not adopting a purely optical approach in this period. So you see the curved lines, the swollen belly, the long chin, the elongated, slender limbs. These show up in all of the figures from the period. Presumably not all of them look that way. And so again, it's an artistic convention. Here we see two other depictions of Akhenaton, a sculpture in the round and a sunken relief. And by the way, sunken relief was the characteristic relief form of this period, in contrast to bas-relief, where the relief is raised up from the stone. In other words, the stone is carved away from the sculpture. In this case, it's carved down. Again, note the unusual elongated skull and the pointed chin, but you also see some traditional conventions, at least in the sculpture in the round. The headdress, the cobra uraeus, the stylized false beard. Nefertiti was Akhenaton's primary wife, although she was not the mother of King Tut. Portrayals of her give her a stature almost equivalent to her husband, a departure from hierarchy of scale, or at least the usual hierarchy of scale. We'll see this again with Ramses II principal wife, Nefertari, or actually I think we have seen it. And I would encourage you to take a look at the tomb paintings that I've placed online. I felt my painting lecture was cut too short, and this is an opportunity to look at some more paintings of a really fascinating woman. At any rate, back to Nefertiti, this painted limestone statue is again remarkably naturalistic. As the Khan Academy lectures that you were assigned point out, we get a real sense of skin and bone here. Now, this sunken relief of Nefertiti worshiping Aten is not actually in your book, but I thought it would help illustrate the art of this period. Note the prominence that Nefertiti is given. You see hierarchy of scale, but she, Nefertiti, even though she's a woman, is clearly a big deal. Note also how Aten is represented as a sun disk emitting rays with hands at the end. And contrast this with the usual depictions of God in Egyptian art as animals or as animal-human combinations. In other reliefs, by the way, Nefertiti is also portrayed in a kingly fashion, usually smiting an enemy. Here, by the way, you see her with one of the traditional crowns of Egypt. Again, this is not typical in depictions of the wives of the pharaoh. This was almost certainly Akhenaton's mother, Tia. Unusually for Egyptians, she was a commoner, although she came from a powerful family. Now, some scholars speculate that she may have been Nubian, that is, from what is now Sudan, south of Egypt, or even Asiatic, but there's no support for this outside the statue itself, which does kind of suggest some racial differentiation. Her son Akhenaton had her elevated to the status of a god, which is why she's wearing the headdress that you see on the right, and that for some reason your textbook decides to leave out. Note again the more naturalistic appearance which is characteristic of Amarna art. This is a statue of an older woman, and it shows. The artist doesn't attempt to disguise this fact. Note also the prominence given to a woman, another characteristic of the Amarna period, or at least of Akhenaton's family, and how he wants them portrayed. On the other hand, her original headdress, including the uraeus, had been removed because her husband had died. Then her son replaced it with a headdress intended for a goddess. This is a particularly famous piece. I'm going to keep building it so you see these curvilinear lines. Notice how the artist departs from hierarchy of scale again, or at least granting Akhenaton and Nefertiti virtually equal status. The Sunken Relief also shows much more naturalistic poses, and it uses curvilinear lines as opposed to the more rectangular lines of most Egyptian art. You see these demonstrated on the slide. It seems possible that the new religion's emphasis on nature led to more naturalistic portrayals in art. Notice, too, the sun with the rays, again, the symbol of Aten, and how these rays seem to be pointing at the two representatives of Aten on earth. Aten, remember, is mother and father. So they're pointing at both Akhenaton and his wife, Nefertiti. The hands reaching out to the king and queen actually end with ankhs. Remember, that's the symbol of the breath of life. But what's really striking about this is how intimate this family portrait seems to be. So here's Akhenaton holding a daughter up to be kissed. Another daughter sits on her mother's lap and reaches for her father, while a baby rests against her mother's shoulder. This is a plausible picture of a loving family. It shows much more emotion than is usually permitted in Egyptian art, and it also shows more movement. These are not the static, eternal figures that we see. On the other hand, we do still see convention. So, for example, they're portrayed in composite poses. The face is in profile, but the eye appears to be facing forward. The bodies are sideways. The feet march forward, although there's a little overlapping. So again, this is not a purely optical approach. Now we're moving on to Akhenaton's famous son, King Tut. He's really only famous because it was the one unopened tomb that archaeologists have found. He was, in fact, a pretty minor king. He died when he was apparently about 19. But it just makes you imagine what the lost riches of the tomb of Ramses II might have been. So, for example, the mummy cover, we're just seeing the face here. We'll see the full mummy cover in a minute, used 1/4 ton of beaten gold, as well as precious stones such as Lapis Lazuli, that's that blue again, turquoise, carnelian, that's the red. Notice, too, that in this piece of art, we see a return to conventional depictions of the pharaoh. The calm, distant serenity of the face, and really not unlike Khafre's from the Old Kingdom. The proportions, such as the distance between the nose and the lips, indicate that this is a youth, and we know that it is. It also indicates, or at least depicts, I should say, a healthy, even perfect youth, again fitting the convention of Egyptian and so many other forms of art of showing the leader as being physically perfect. In this case, though, we know more about Tut since we have his mummy, and doctors have studied his DNA. These DNA studies have shown that Tut had a cleft palate, a club foot, and that he had contracted malaria before he died, which might suggest a weakened immune system. We also know from the DNA that his father and mother, his mother was not Nefertiti, were full siblings, were brother and sister, had the same mother and father themselves. Finally, Tut was buried with a number of ornate walking sticks, beautifully inlaid with jewels. But the doctors who examined him think he probably needed walking sticks to walk. We see lots of traditional symbols in this work of art. There's the traditional Nemes headcloth. I don't think I didn't spell that out on the slide. It's Nemes. This is the same headcloth you see on Khafre, you see on the sphinx, it might be a good term to know. You see the false beard, in this case inlaid with precious jewels. You see the kingly uraeus cobra of Lower Egypt. In this case, it's combined with the vulture neckbed, I did spell that one, of Upper Egypt. Note how similar this is to the Narmer palette in that it evokes the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, even though this is, more than 1,000 years later in Egyptian history. You might also recall that gold and lapis lazuli were used as decorative elements in the tombs of Mesopotamian Ur. These are obviously minerals and jewels with great significance in this part of the world. Well, now we get a look at this full gold coffin, and we see a couple more symbols. The staff and the flail. The staff, of course, is a persistent symbol in the Near East, representing leadership and care, the shepherd. This is a symbol that's going to carry through into Christian art through Jesus' description of himself as the Good Shepherd. The flail is used to punish enemies or wrongdoers. And again, it's a demonstration of Tutankhamun's leadership as pharaoh. But is the Amarna period entirely over by the time of his son, Akhenaton's son, King Tut? This is an image on Tut's throne. In fact, it is Tut's throne. And again, it's not in your book, but I thought it was very interesting. What features of the image on this throne remind you of Amarna art? And by the way, it would be good to take some notes here of this discussion, because this is going to show up on your essay question. Not this throne, but the Amarna art. So what do you see? Well, again, there's the sun with its discs rather than animal shapes or heads depicting gods. You see some of the body characteristics, the curved belly, the curved limbs, the elongated limbs, the long neck and chin. You see the affectionate pose between Tut and his wife, who, by the way, was also his half-sister. She's putting scented oil on his collar, which is an act of surprising intimacy, and again, shows some movement. Again, you see a hand from the sun's ray offering the couple the ankh, or sign of life. But you also see traditional signs. So, for example, the traditional lion heads on the throne. And now we will move on to the funerary arts of China, Japan, and Africa, and then finally to our first full unit test.